Good morning, Matrix. I know that you are about to write paper 2 tomorrow, so please guys go over that poetry that I did with you, and I want to just give you a few little pointers for your prose, in other words, for your novels and for your drama. The novel that I did with my class was The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that now. I will do more before your finals, but I just want to have a few little pointers here that you may not be aware of. I want to talk about the image of the Napier clowns. Now, Napier, he was Harold Fry's employer at the breweries. And there's no doubt about it that Napier was an absolute thug and a bully. And what Harold does is, when he finds out about his son's suicide, he rushes into Napier's office, and Napier owned a collection of glass clowns, and Harold rushes in, smashes the clowns, and that's when Queenie stands in for him and says that she did it. And of course, what Napier does is he immediately fires Queenie. So that is what Queenie has done for Harold, and that's why Harold feels that he has got to go and see her. He owes her a debt of gratitude. Please be aware of the theme of suicide that runs through this novel. We know that David's death changed things, or rather accelerated a destruction of Harold and Maureen's wedding. We know that David was high and drunk when he committed suicide, and on Harold's journey he meets a young woman who is quite loud and overconfident, but he spies on her wrists scars of a recent attempted suicide. We get the feeling that she may be a manic depressive. One moment she's high, and then the next she's very low. Please also note that the garden shed is an important setting. The garden shed was like a little potting shed where David hanged himself from a hook that the tools were normally hung from. Harold discovers him there. Later he destroys the shed as a means of trying to cope with David's death. And then also be aware of the symbolism of the net curtains. Maureen hangs those net curtains up at the front windows of her house when David dies. She doesn't want the neighbors to see in. So it's a kind of barrier between her and the outside world. And she never takes them off until Harold has gone on his walk, and she decides on a particular day that she's going to wash them. And as she takes them down, she sees the sunlight pouring in, and in fact those curtains never get put back again. All right guys, I'm going to move straight on to Long Day's journey into night, and I want to talk about the men. I hope I'm going to get enough time to speak about the 3 Tyrone men. I'm going to start off with Jamie, because although he's cynical, he's bitter, he's arrogant, and he's mean, he's probably the one that is the most honest. He speaks his mind. And we know that Jamie goes back into the past, as do all the characters. We see that the father does the same. We see that Edmund does the same. In fact, they are time travelers. They go back into time. But we, the audience, also are pulled back into time. And for us to understand anything about Jamie, we have to understand his past. We have to understand that Mary says that Jamie purposefully infected Eugene with measles. What a horrendous accusation is that from a mother to her 7-year-old child. I mean, Jamie was 7. That must have affected his life from that moment on. Mary also says that he seemed to have a fine brain, that he had glowing reports, but at a point he starts drinking and he gets expelled. And then things are never the same for Jamie. But can you imagine taking the horror of being accused of murder by your mother, who is supposed to be the one that supports you? You can imagine Jamie dragging that burden with him all his young life. Also, the situation in present day, he's 33 years old, he lives at home, he doesn't work, the family have given up on him. So he turns to alcohol and women. He turns to fat Violet. He turns to prostitutes who are very fat and overweight. And yet there was something kind about him when he hires her and sleeps with her to save her job because she is getting too old and too fat. And there's something about fat Violet. She provides Jamie with unconditional affection, which is something that his mother has not done, and his father has long ago tossed any affection out of the window for him. We also feel sorry for Jamie because he's the only person in the play where whom nobody seems to love anymore. So the reader, the audience are drawn. We are drawn to him. Let's have a look at Edmund, the other brother. Yes, we see Edmund as a bit of a victim. He has a painful birth. During his birth, Mary is given morphine. She gets hooked on morphine. She worries again about his TB. He may be causing the addiction to rise again. His father is a bit of a miser. He wants to send him off to a second-rate sanatorium. His brother, which is Jamie, has said that he's quite revengeful and doesn't really like him at times. So unlike any of the other characters in this play, Edmund is relatively blameless for the situation that he finds himself in. I mean, his father and his brother continuously encourage him to drink. So we wonder, is there anything that he would be responsible for? And it doesn't seem to be much. We do have some hope, though, for Edmund, because he's the one, guys, and I think it's in Act 4, where he talks about this experience that he has, where he transcends the world and his suffering, and he feels this one. He's talking about the ocean. And we feel that in that recognition of that ecstasy, there is a way for him to transcend the horror and the misery of his life. I'd also like you to think of Edmund not only as a time traveler, because he also goes back into time, but he also, like Jamie, like the father, like Mary, they are escape artists. They escape from reality. He's just, Edmund is like the other men in the family. He hides in the fog, as does Mary. In fact, Edmund even loves to walk in the fog as well. He also plays the philosopher poet. So he loves reading poetry. He talks about Nietzsche, who is a German philosopher. And then, of course, we hear about this transcendental experience which he has. Yes, there's a little meanness in him too. He doesn't shy away from a fight with his brother. He hits Jamie, but of course in defense for his mother. It just seems that Edmund has to resort to a little violence to keep the peace, and that's a strange sort of irony there. So guys, go back to Act 4, have a look at that sea speech. I think it tells us a lot about Jamie. Guys, I want to just quickly have a look at Edmund the foil, because here we have Edmund is the good son. He's the sensitive son, the smart son, the shy son. He is nursed over and worried about by his parents, and he is an ideal foil to Jamie. Jamie, who's seen as the bad son, lazy, rebellious. The family have long given up on him. Guys, then I'm going to have a look at James, the father. Yes, he can be naive, he can be sentimental and charming, but he can also be grumpy. He's the first one to initiate an argument. He's always on the defensive. He doesn't act the adult. He acts the child, always trying to defend himself. And he's always at Jamie's throat. In fact, they are always fighting. He's not really a responsible parent, neither is Mary. So we wonder at, well, we can't wonder at how Edmund and Jamie turn out. Remember that James's own father left him when he was 10, and he never had a role model for a father, so he doesn't know how to behave. There's no doubt about it that he is an alcoholic. Earlier on, we hear how he would give his sons whiskey as a little bit of medicine. He gives Edmund whiskey as a tonic for his TB. And he and his sons, they drink all day, but he refuses to admit that he has any problem. We hear from Mary that on their honeymoon, he got so drunk, so blotto, that they had to lug him upstairs. His friends had to lug him upstairs. He couldn't walk. And the moment someone accuses him of being an alcoholic, he says, you know, he's not an alcoholic. He's made it to every rehearsal, and he never was late. When he was an actor, he always played the role. And that's his reasoning for not being an alcoholic. So we hear that James abuses this whiskey. Now, in Ireland, whiskey is called water of life. However, James uses this water of life to avoid life altogether. In the last act, we see James alone, drinking. He's got his 2 bottles of whiskey, and we see that James has become an old, lonely man. And there's reason for his misery and his suffering. Edmund may be dying, Jamie loathes him, and his wife is a morphine addict, and he's an alcoholic. So there seems to be very little hope for him. The problem is he is partly to blame. Just like his wife, he accuses her, but just like her, he hides from his problems in a cycle of drunken bouts. So he's much like her. Also, he is a penny pincher. He's a miser. He insists on paying his chauffeur a low wage. He lives in a shabby house in which everything is done on the cheap. We see him trying to take out the globes and the bulbs because he doesn't want so many lights on it, at once. He uses cheap doctors like Doc Hardy for his wife when she was having their son, and now he wants to negotiate a cheap deal for Edmund so that Edmund can go into some sanatorium, second-rate sanatorium. Let's also just have a look at James. He's obsessed with land, and we wonder why. But we see that at age 10, he took on the family. He's worried he's going to land in the poorhouse, so he feels that land is the one thing that will keep him out of the poorhouse. We see that James, like Edmund, like Jamie, go back into the past. And as we said, there is a horror of the past, of Eugene dying, of Jamie being blamed, of Mary feeling guilty. So it seems that their past is not really the place for them to take refuge in. Guys, I hope that will help you. I will post more on the literature and the language, in fact, as your finals approach. Good luck for tomorrow. Remember, you must do 1 literature essay on one of your set works, and then do the contextual on the other set work. You've got poetry to do. I think it's 2 scene poems and then an unseen poem, which is absolutely essential. You have to do the unseen poem. You have no choice. Guys, I'm suggesting you avoid the poetry essays, the little mini poetry essay, far more difficult. You don't get as many marks as you do for a contextual on the poetry. So rather do that than the little poetry mini essay. Good luck, guys. Au revoir.